June 14, 2012. Blackwater Flats, Louisiana. By sunrise, the last truck had already left. It rolled slowly down the cracked dirt road, its tires grinding against a crust of white salt that shimmered like frost under the early light. In the back, tied down with frayed rope, were the final pieces of a life someone had given up on rusted tools, a broken irrigation pipe, a wooden sign that once read, Turner Corn. No one stayed to watch it disappear. No one, except one man. Elias Turner stood alone at the edge of his field, his boots half buried in soil that had long forgotten how to be called soil. The wind carried a dry, bitter smell, like the ocean had died here years ago and never left. And in front of him, his land stretched out like a grave, white, cracked, silent. But he didn't look at it like that, because at that exact moment, while every other farmer within 50 miles had already walked away, Elias Turner lowered the rusted blade of his old tractor into the ground and began to plow. Not gently, not hesitantly, but as if something beneath that dead earth was still listening. And that was when the second truck arrived. It wasn't like the others. It was clean, new, expensive. The kind of truck that didn't belong anywhere near a place like Blackwater Flats. It stopped right in the middle of the road, dust curling around its tires, and for a moment the engine didn't even shut off, like whoever was inside didn't feel the need to rush. Then the door opened. Daniel Cross stepped out. He adjusted his sunglasses before his boots ever touched the ground, as if the sunlight here needed to be filtered before it deserved his eyes. His shirt was crisp sleeves rolled just enough to suggest effort without ever showing it. Everything about him looked like it had been designed, not lived in. He took one look at the land, then at Elias, then at the tractor, and he smiled. Not the kind of smile you give when you're impressed. The kind you give when something confirms what you already believed. He walked forward slowly, hands in his pockets until the sound of the tractor grew loud enough to force Elias to stop. The engine coughed once, then settled into silence. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. The wind did. It pushed loose grains of salt across the surface of the field, whispering over the cracked ground, like a warning that had already been ignored too many times. Daniel broke it. "You're still trying." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of someone who assumed he was right before he ever opened his mouth. Elias didn't answer. He stepped down from the tractor, slow, deliberate, like a man who had no reason to rush anything, not even this conversation. Daniel glanced around again, gesturing loosely at the land. "I've seen lab reports," he said. "Salinity levels off the charts. Soil structure collapsed. There's nothing left here." He looked back at Elias, tilting his head slightly. "This isn't farming anymore." Still no answer. A small group had begun to gather at the edge of the road. Not many. Maybe 8, 10 people. Some former farmers who hadn't left yet. Some who came back just to see what would happen. Word travels fast in places like this, especially when something feels like the end. Daniel noticed them, and something in his expression shifted. He took a few more steps forward, now speaking just a little louder. "My company just acquired most of this land," he said. "We're converting it. Solar fields. Energy contracts. That's the only thing this place is good for now." A pause, then just loud enough for the others to hear clearly. "You're standing on a dead investment." A few chuckles. Elias didn't didn't react, and somehow, that made it worse. Daniel exhaled through his nose. I was almost amused now. He walked closer to the tractor, running a hand along its rusted side panel. The paint flaked under his touch, leaving a faint orange dust on his fingers. "This thing still runs?" he asked. Someone from the crowd laughed. Barely another voice added. Daniel tapped the metal lightly. "You know," he said, turning slightly so everyone could see him. "Machines like this belong in museums, not in fields." More laughter. And then he looked directly at Elias. "You really think this?" He gestured toward the tractor, then toward the land. "Is going to save anything?" This time Elias answered. His voice was low, even, almost quiet enough to miss if you weren't listening for it. I'm not trying to save it. The laughter faded just a little. Daniel frowned, not because he didn't understand, but because he didn't expect an answer like that. Then what are you doing? Elias looked out across the field. For a moment, it almost seemed like he wasn't looking at what was there. But it's something that used to be, or something that might still be. I'm listening, he said. Silence. Then someone snorted. Daniel shook his head, smiling again, wider this time. That's not how soil works. No, Elias replied, still not looking at him. That's how people talk about soil. A few people exchanged glances. Daniel let out a short laugh. All right, he said. Let us make this simple. He stepped closer. Close enough now that there was no space left for pretending this wasn't personal. You've got 3 months, he said. After that, this land is part of our development. Contracts are already signed. He paused. And whatever you think you're doing here, he leaned in slightly. It's not going to change anything. Another ripple of quiet laughter. But there was something else now, too. Something smaller, something unsure, because Elias hadn't moved, hadn't argued, hadn't even looked at him. Daniel straightened up, brushing the salt dust from his hands like it offended him. Good luck, he said. Then he turned and walked back to his truck. The engine roared to life. The tires spun, kicking up a cloud of white grit that drifted across the field, across Elias, across the tractor. And just like that, they were gone. The crowd lingered for a moment longer. Wanamachon shook his head. You should have taken the money, he muttered. Another laughed softly. Old man's lost it. One by one they left too, until there was nothing left again, except the wind, and Elias, and the tractor. But there was something none of them understood. Not Daniel, not the men who laughed, not even the ones who used to farm this land. Because this story was never really about dead soil. Elias Turner was born on that same stretch of land in the fall of 1962, when Blackwater Flats was still green enough to make people jealous. Back then, the soil was dark and soft, rich, with the kind of life that didn't need to be measured to be trusted. Corn grew tall, water ran clear, and the wind didn't taste like salt. His father, Samuel Turner, rarely spoke more than he needed to, but when he did, people listened. Not because he was loud, but because he was almost always right. Elias learned early that his father didn't farm the way others did. He didn't follow schedules, didn't chase yields, didn't talk about numbers the way the other men at the grain store did. He watched, he waited, he walked the fields barefoot sometimes long before sunrise, as if the ground said more before the world woke up. And Elias followed him, at first just to keep up, later to understand. There's always a reason, Samuel would say, crouching down, running dry soil through his fingers. Even when it looks like there isn't. When the first signs of salt began to show, most men blamed the drought. Samuel didn't. He dug. Not deep wells, not big trenches, just narrow channels. Curved. Careful. Placed where no one else thought to look. People laughed at him. Said he was wasting time, but he kept going. Because he saw something they didn't. And years later, that same way of seeing would be the only reason his son didn't walk away. But I need to tell you something important here, because the land didn't start dying all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, like something being taken apart piece by piece, while everyone was still arguing about whether it was broken at all. The drought stretched longer than anyone expected. 1 year turned into 2, 2 into 4. The rain stopped coming when it mattered. And when it finally did come, it came wrong, too hard, too fast, pulling minerals up from deep below, leaving salt behind like a scar. Crops failed, then failed again and again. Men who had farmed that land their entire lives began to leave. Some sold, some lost everything, some just locked their doors and never came back. Samuel stayed. Of course he did. But something changed in him during those years. He worked longer, spoke less, and the things he built in the soil became stranger. Elias remembered one night in particular. He was maybe 15. The moon was low, barely enough to see by, and his father was still out in the field, adjusting one of those narrow channels. Why are you doing this? Elias asked. Samuel didn't look up. Because it's not the salt that kills the land. Elias frowned. Then what is? Samuel finally stood, wiping his hand slowly on his pants. It's the way the salt moves, he said. A pause. Most people try to fight it. He shook his head slightly. You have to give it somewhere to go. Elias didn't fully understand then, but he remembered it. He remembered everything, especially the machine. The tractor. It wasn't new even back then. An old heavy thing with more metal than comfort, loud enough to wake half the county when it started. Samuel had rebuilt parts of it himself, piece by piece over the years. Not to make it faster, not to make it easier, but to make it precise. It could dig deeper without breaking the structure of the soil, could move slower, but with more control. Elias didn't know why that mattered at the time, but his father did. And when Samuel died quietly one winter morning before the sun came up, he left the tractor exactly where it stood. He didn't leave instructions, didn't leave a map, didn't leave money, just the land, the machine, and a way of seeing things that most people had already forgotten. And that was the only reason Elias Turner was still standing there on June 14th, 2012, while everyone else had already walked away. For the next 3 months, nothing changed. At least, that's what people said. By late July, the heat had turned Blackwater Flats into something that barely resembled land at all. The surface cracked wider, deeper. The white crust thickened. Even the wind seemed sharper, carrying grains of salt that stung the skin if you stood out too long. And every single morning before the sun had fully risen, Elias Turner was all ready out there. The tractor started the same way each day, a long, low cough, a metallic shudder, then a steady, stubborn rhythm that sounded less like a machine and more like something refusing to quit. He didn't plant. That confused people, if anyone still bothered to drive past, which at first a few did. They would slow down, expecting to see rows. See something that looked like effort in the usual way. But Elias wasn't planting anything. He was digging, not wide trenches, not straight lines, but narrow, curved channels that seemed to follow no logic at all. Some ended abruptly, some circled back, some crossed over others like veins under the skin of the land. And if you didn't know what you were looking at, it looked like madness. By August, the rumors had settled into something simpler. He's lost it. They said it at the feed store. They said it at the gas station 20 miles out. Even the men who used to respect the Turner name stopped defending it, because from the outside it made no sense. 3 months were passing, and Elias hadn't grown a single thing. But there was something he noticed that no one else did. Late one evening, just as the heat finally began to lift, he crouched down near one of the shallow channels he'd cut weeks earlier. The ground there looked no different at first, still pale, still dry, still dead. But when he pressed his fingers into it, it gave, just slightly, not enough for anyone else to care, but enough for him to stop. Because that kind of softness didn't belong in soil like this, not anymore. He didn't smile, didn't say anything. He just stood up and went back to the tractor. And that was the moment everything truly began. But I need to stop here for a second, because what Elias was doing didn't look important. And that's exactly why everyone missed it. He wasn't trying to grow crops. Not yet. He was trying to move something no one else believed could even be controlled anymore. Salt. Most men had fought it, tried to wash it away, tried to bury it, tried to outwork it. Elias didn't do any of that. He gave it a path. Each narrow channel he carved wasn't random. It followed the lowest resistance beneath the surface paths his father had once traced years ago. Paths that had been forgotten when the land first began to fail. But there was something deeper, something even his father hadn't fully reached, and Elias had started to suspect it. Not because he read it, not because someone told him, but because of the way the ground felt, under pressure. Because of the way certain patches held moisture just a second longer than they should have, because of something buried, far below the salt. And what he found next would change everything. It happened in the second year. By then, most people had stopped checking. The roads were quieter. The conversations had moved on. Blackwater Flats was no longer something people argued about. It was something they forgot. Except for one thing, Elias was still there. And now he had started digging deeper. Not across the entire field, just in certain places, specific points where his channels seemed to pull toward, like invisible lines were guiding them. The tractor struggled at first. The ground hardened quickly below the surface layer packed tight with years of mineral buildup. But that old machine, the one Daniel had laughed at, it didn't move like modern tractors. It moved slower, heavier. But when the blade went down, it held, didn't skip, didn't bounce, didn't tear the structure apart. It pressed through, carefully, deliberately, as if it had been built for exactly this kind of work. Because in a way, it had. Elias remembered something his father once did years ago in the middle of a dry season. He had taken the engine apart, not to fix it, but to change it. Elias didn't understand at the time, but now he did. The torque, lower, stronger, built not for speed, but for control under resistance. The kind of control you needed if you were trying to reach something buried without collapsing everything above it. And one afternoon, under a sky that hadn't held a cloud in weeks, he hit it. The blade dropped. The engine strained. Then suddenly, it didn't. The resistance disappeared. Just for a second. Just enough to make Elias stop the tractor completely. He climbed down slowly, walked to the cut, knelt, and pressed his hand into the soil. This time, it wasn't just soft. It was damp, cool, and beneath his fingers, there was something else. Not mud, not salt, water. Not much, not flowing, but there, held in a thin, fragile layer beneath everything that had suffocated it for years. A freshwater lens, old, trapped, hidden, waiting. Elias sat back, slowly staring at the ground like he was looking at something alive. Because in a way, he was. But here's the part nobody understood. Finding water wasn't the miracle. Anyone could dig a hole and hope. But if you broke the structure, if you let the salt collapse inward, that water would disappear again, forever. And that's why the machine mattered. That's why every cut he made, every channel, every inch of soil he moved, had to be exact. Because this wasn't about reaching the water. It was about teaching the land how to breathe again. And from that moment on, everything Elias did changed. The third year was when the pressure came back. Not from the land, from people. Because word has a way of returning. At first it was small. A man passing through noticed something strange. A patch of ground not green, but darker, less white, less dead. He didn't believe it. So he came back a week later, then brought someone else. By the time the fourth year began, people were watching again. Not laughing this time. But not believing either. Daniel Cross heard about it too. Of course he did. A report came across his desk. Something about unusual soil variation in a section that had already been marked for development. He almost ignored it. Almost. But something about a name attached to it made him pause. Turner. He drove out himself this time. Didn't announce it. Didn't bring a team. Just him. And that same kind of clean, expensive truck that still didn't belong there. But the land didn't look the same anymore. Not entirely. Most of it was still white. Still cracked. Still harsh. But there were lines now. Faint. Subtle. Running across the surface like something underneath had started to shift. And in the distance, the tractor was moving. Slow. Steady. Unchanged. Daniel stepped out, scanning the field, trying to understand what he was seeing. Because it didn't match the reports. Didn't match the models. Didn't match anything he knew. And for the first time, there was no smile on his face. Because something was happening here. Something that wasn't supposed to happen. And Elias Turner was still not explaining a single word. By the fifth year, people stopped calling it impossible. They just didn't know what to call it anymore. Because what had started as faint, darker lines across the field had turned into something undeniable. Patterns, not random, not accidental, but deliberate. The white crust of salt had begun to break apart in long, winding paths. Paths that followed the exact channels Elias had carved years before. In between those lines, the soil wasn't healthy. Not yet. But it wasn't dead either. And that difference was enough to bring people back. At first they came quietly, parking along the dirt road, standing at a distance, watching without speaking. Some of them had left this land years ago. Some had sold everything they owned just to escape what they believed was the end. Now they stood there again, unsure of what they were seeing, Because it didn't make sense. Nothing about it did. Except to one man. Elias never acknowledged them. He worked the same way he always had. Before sunrise, after sunset. Slow, measured. Every movement of that old tractor still precise, still controlled, like he was following something no one else could see. But then in the late summer of that 5th year, everything changed. The storm came in without warning. It wasn't the kind of rain people prayed for. It was the kind they feared. Heavy, relentless, sheets of water falling so hard, it flattened what little life had begun to return. The wind tore across Blackwater Flats, like it had a score to settle, ripping loose soil, pushing water across the surface with violent force. People watched from miles away, shaking their heads. That'll finish it. 5 years for nothing. Even Daniel Cross heard about the storm, and this time, he didn't wait. He drove out the next morning. The sky was still gray, the ground soaked, and the entire field looked like it had been dragged underwater and pulled back out again. From a distance, it looked ruined, flooded, destroyed. But as he stepped closer, he stopped because the water wasn't sitting. It was moving, slowly, but clearly, flowing through the land, not randomly, not chaotically, but along the exact lines Elias had carved years before. Those channels, the ones everyone laughed at, were guiding everything. The rainwater rushed through them, pulling the salt along with it, dragging it away from the soil instead of letting it settle back in. And in between those channels, the ground was holding, not collapsing, not drowning, breathing. Daniel walked further in his boots, sinking slightly into soil that should have been rock hard. He crouched down, scooping a handful. It was darker, heavier, alive, and that was when he saw it, just a few feet away from where he stood. A thin line of green, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it, but unmistakable. A small row of shoot and pushing through the surface, not planted in neat rows, not part of any organized field, but there, growing. Daniel stood up slowly, turned, and for the first time since he had stepped foot on Blackwater Flats, he didn't have anything to say, because what happened next was the part nobody forgot. By the end of that year, the green had spread. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough. Enough that you could stand at the edge of the field and see it without trying. Enough that people started coming not just to watch, but to ask. How? Elias never answered directly. He showed them the channels, the flow, the patience, but he never explained it the way they wanted, because the truth wasn't simple, and it wasn't fast. By the 7th year, the land had changed in a way no report could capture. Sections of the field were fully green now. Crops not perfect, not uniform, but strong enough to harvest. The air didn't taste like salt anymore. The wind carried something different, something softer, and the same men who once laughed were now asking if they could come back. Some brought their families, some brought seeds, some just stood there, staring at what they had walked away from. Daniel Cross returned too, but this time, he didn't arrive like he owned the place. He didn't speak first, didn't smile. He walked up to Elias, who was standing beside the same tractor, the engine idling low, for a long moment. Neither man spoke. Then Daniel finally said quietly, "I was wrong." Elias didn't react, didn't nod, didn't accept it. He just looked out over the field, because this had never been about proving anyone wrong. And somehow, that made it heavier. The company Daniel represented pulled out within the year. The contracts collapsed. Investors didn't want land that refused to behave the way it was supposed to. Millions were lost. Plans disappeared. And Blackwater Flats was no longer considered dead. It was something else now. Something people didn't fully understand. Which meant they finally started paying attention. But here's the part that stayed with people the longest. The part they talked about years later. The part that turned a man like Elias Turner into something they couldn't quite define. He didn't sell the land. Not to developers. Not to corporations. Not even when the offers came back higher, this time much higher. Instead, he let people return, slowly, carefully, on one condition. Don't rush it. That's all he said. No contracts, no speeches, no explanations. Just that. And somehow, that was enough, because the land kept changing, year after year. The green spread wider. The soil deepened. The salt faded. Not completely. Never completely. But enough. Enough to remind everyone that it had been there, that it had almost won, and that it hadn't. Years later, when people told the story, they always focused on the same thing. The miracle. The land that came back. The crops that grew where nothing should have grown. But they missed something. Something quieter. Something harder to see. Because this story was never really about defeating the land. It was about understanding it. Elias Turner never gave interviews, never wrote anything down, never explained his method in a way that could be replicated step by step. And maybe that was the point. Because what he knew wasn't something you could copy. It wasn't in the machine, even though that old tractor still running, still working, became a symbol people pointed to. It wasn't in the channels, even though they reshaped the entire field. It wasn't even in the water beneath the surface. It was in the way he saw it all. The patience, the restraint, the refusal to force something that needed time, and the understanding that just because something looks dead doesn't mean it is. Some men saw salt and walked away. Some saw numbers and made plans. Some saw profit and built futures on what they thought was certainty. But one man stood still long enough to listen, and because of that, 8 years later, the land spoke back.